Jay, you've got a PhD in the invention of Palestine, which when you see the words there, you think, oh my gosh, what's this about? Tell us, how did you come across doing that? And tell us a little bit about the PhD, because it sounds fascinating.
For many decades, I would say there's been a genre of literature called, the invention of insert whatever you study here, the invention of nature, the invention of science, the invention of Israel, the invention of the Jewish people, a very popular book. What we've come to realize as historians is that all of these concepts, peoples, ethnicities, races, nations, places themselves, they're all just social constructs, right? If you go and ask a typologist or a specialist in soil or a specialist in topography, there is no such thing as Germany or France or Italy or Israel or Palestine. These are all constructs that human beings have invented. And so what I've tried to do over the course of the dissertation is try and explain when, why, and how this concept of Palestine came about, and when, why, and how people identified with that place called Palestine, and thus when, why, and how people identified as Palestinians. And so I'm very much taking, the super bird's eye view, like the 100,000-foot overview of the history of these concepts, which I would say is generally it's a very unconventional approach for a dissertation, right? Dissertations tend to cover, in history at least, they tend to cover a few years of history, maybe a few decades of history, but a few millennia or a few tens of thousands of years, like no one's writing dissertations spanning tens of thousands of years of history. And so that's sort of, I would say, one very unique thing I tried to do in their dissertation was zoom out. Obviously, that makes it harder to do other things, right? That means you can't get as deep into the weeds in every single period or with as many sources as you could otherwise. But I think that bird's eye view does add some extra insight into the history of these concepts. And so start off in the pre-modern, the pre-modern world, really the pre-Neolithic world, before there was even writing, right? And so I'm asking myself, like, when is it that Homo sapiens in human history began to identify with places like Palestine? And when I say like Palestine, what I mean is a very, very large space, a space so large that you cannot see with your own two eyes, a space so large that you need things like maps, you need things like history books, you need things like geography books, you need institutions dedicated to the study of those places. You need all of these things to make those places seem real, because, like I said, you can't see them. You can see a city, you can see your family, you can see a town, a village. So you can identify with those things much easier because we're a very visual species. We need to see things if we want to be able to identify with them. And so when do all of these things, like maps, like history books, like geography books, like institutions dedicated to Palestine, when do these things come about? When do they get popular? When do maps start spreading, maps of Palestine? When do they start spreading? When do kids start learning about Palestine in schools? When do kids start taking trips around Palestine and learning about Palestine's sacredness and about Palestine's holiness? When do all those things start to happen in history? And so what I try and argue is that if you can trace those things and you can see when they start to spread and when people start to read history and geography books of map and see maps of Palestine, my argument is that then you would start to see Palestinian identity. And so this happens in the 10th century, and it also happens in the late 19th century. That's, I would say, if I had to summarize my dissertation in a few minutes, that's how I would summarize it.
How was it received? I mean, you have to defend it, your dissertation. I just imagine, at Princeton, Ivy League college, that, they all lined up to go, how dare you?
You're absolutely right. I definitely got a lot of pushback from the dissertation on many, many fronts. I got pushback from many Zionists, obviously, because I'm saying a lot of things that Zionists are uncomfortable with. I'm challenging a number of Zionist myths, which I'm happy to get into, such as this myth that the Roman Emperor Hadrian vengefully erased the name Judea in 135 CE, and he replaced it with the name Palestine after crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt. I tried to dispel that myth, and I also tried to dispel all these myths around southern Syria. There's a popular Zionist myth that how Palestinians always called the place Syria. There was no, that they themselves called it even southern Syria, which I get into the story of when that phrase came about and when it got popular and why. Short of that story is that basically the phrase southern Syria was never really all that popular in the history of Palestine, really ever, just for a very short 2-year period from 1918 to 1920. And essentially ever since then, it's been politicized on both sides, actually, by both Palestinians and Jewish Zionists. On the Palestinian side, Palestinians have tried to explain that basically there was no Palestine, that it was always Syria, because they wanted unity with Syria, because they believed that that was the best approach of freeing Palestine from British colonialism and from Zionism. And they thought actually that was the best way to end Zionist immigration and end Zionist land purchases. And so out of their love for Palestine, out of their desire to decolonize Palestine. They opposed even the concept of Palestine because they thought that would lead the British to hand over Palestine to Syria and the French Syrian government. So that's another myth I try and dispel. I obviously get into the origins of the Palestinian people. You probably know the myths around Golda Meir famously saying there's no such thing as a Palestinian. And it's not just Golda Meir, by the way. If you look at many American politicians, Ted Cruz, Newt Gingrich, Mike Huckabee, you have many mainstream Republican politicians in the US regurgitating this nonsense. And so I try and get into the origins of when did people start to call themselves Palestinians? 1890s is the answer, not 1960s. So that's another myth I try to dispel. On the one hand, I got a lot of pushback from Zionists. On the other hand, I got pushback actually from some academics as well, including, I would say, my own dissertation advisor, as well as some other members of my committee, because I was interested in trying to reach a broader audience. I was interested in speaking to people who don't have an academic background, who aren't really interested in the academic debates, who are actually much more curious about the propaganda and believe in the propaganda or disbelieve in the propaganda. So I was trying to speak to those broader audiences, not just in the content, but also in the writing style. And so those things definitely were a huge turnoff for my dissertation advisor, and also for a number of really, I would say most members of my committee were also a little bit put off by it. There's nothing good or bad about certain writing styles. It just depends on who you're trying to reach. Yeah. So those are the 2 points I would make about the pushback was the, I would say, the Zionist pushback and also the academic pushback.
We can't divorce the concept, Malcolm Hollien, and I want to read that quote and talk about this, that he said that the Roman Emperor Hadrian, this started when the Romans changed the name of Judea to Philistia. This was the beginning of BDS. So, 1800 years ago. We can't divorce the concept of Palestinians being a made-up people from the propaganda that wants to disassociate native indigenous people from a bit of dirt and, the colonial consequences of that.
Absolutely. For many decades, there has been an effort on the part of historians, including some of the most respected historians ever to have written about the Middle East, including some of the most famous and most influential historians, Bernard Lewis chief among them, who have been hell-bent on trying to undermine the existence of a Palestinian people. And the reason is quite obvious, right? For those folks who believe in nation states and who believe that nations have rights to self-determination, the very existence of a Palestinian people is obviously very problematic for the Zionist narrative, because it means that the Zionists don't have exclusive national rights to this land that they have to share with the Palestinians. And so that's obviously hugely problematic. And so wouldn't it be great if there were no Palestinians, if they had never had any connection to Palestine? In fact, wouldn't it be great if they never even identified as Palestinian? So there's been this entire genre of history writing that has been dedicated to trying to point out all of these instances where they think either Palestinians call themselves other things, Arabs, Southern Syrians, or even to try and even delegitimize even the name Palestine, right? So this is where this story comes into play, where there's this desire to even identify the first political usage of the word Palestine in history, which they claim comes after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE. We're talking 1900 years ago. So there's this desire to try and claim that, even this very first instance of Palestine in history was somehow delegitimate or somehow anti-Semitic, or somehow, the first instance of BDS, as that, according to the quote you just cited.
Crazy stuff. As a Palestinian, this whole debate is about demonizing Palestinians and to frame us as usurpers of the land, to tie us to some sort of Roman persecution of Jews. It's purely politically motivated, a talking point amongst Zionists and their supporters to just, remove us from our indigeneity. And it forces Palestinians to constantly refocus and refight an existing fight that we're not indigenous, that we didn't belong, that, in fact, Yasser Arafat's Egyptian, that Palestinians just came in from Jordan, the land, there was nobody in the land. It was a land without people for a people without a land. Hopefully with work like yours, Zach, we look forward to the day when we're not having to fight these battles anymore. And we can recover a hijacked history that's been just manipulated for a Zionist narrative.